Check, check. There. Hi, I'm Father Ryan Humphreys, and the sound is now working for the next 20 seconds. This is the Catholic Underground CU Catecast. I'm very, very happy to have you with us. Today is the anniversary of the death of two people who were both known for their powerful interpersonal observation, their interpersonal skill, and their capacity to reach the hearts of people. In 1939, Sigmund Shlomo Freud died at the age of 83. He was from Austria but lived in London. And in 1968, Francesco Forcione, who took the religious name Padre Pio, was known popularly as Padre Pio, died at the age of 81. Now, Freud was known for psychoanalysis. He studied human behavior in intense detail, and he created an image of the human person, which functions as a kind of rejection and maybe even kind of a mockery of Augustine's notion of the human person. But all of human behavior, according to Freud, is selfish, and it functions to balance three competing ideological or psychological functions within. We have the ego, the superego, and the id. And I just want to make sure my sound works. The ego, the superego, and the id. Now, this balance, according to Freud, is driven by this kind of mixed obsession and terror of sex and death. Pio, Padre Pio, was known for reading souls in the confessional and for bearing the stigmata of Jesus, the wounds of Jesus Christ. Pio didn't study human behavior. He didn't write a complex reimagining of human nature to accommodate his own issues. He sat in the confessional, he prayed, he suffered, and he obeyed the Lord. So these two people could not make for a more stark contrast. And that contrast between these two great people, genuinely great men who genuinely reached thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in the course of their lives, touching them at the very core of themselves, the stark contrast between them raises some really important questions, and those questions come down to us nowadays, and they're questions that people oftentimes will call or text or Facebook message or whatever their pastor and say, Father, how do I deal with this? What should I do about that? And so let's ask a couple of kind of broad questions and then tighten those questions up to something about our daily lives. So let's start with what is psychology, right? We have psychology ultimately boils down to the field of study of the emotional mind. And so we're talking about a broad spectrum of theories here. We're talking about stuff that is incredibly obvious, like people have feelings, people have passions, all the way to very specific things from Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud and other people. Psychology is ultimately kind of a reimagining, for the most part, it's a reimagining of the human psyche without God, which is a problem. Not all psychology rejects God, but an awful lot of it tries to pretend that we can rethink and re-understand the human being separate from or detached from who God is. And that's a problem. It's part of the reason that some psychology really doesn't work. It's part of the reason that some psychology really ends up being very anti-human. The theories within this broad study of psychology ultimately have value according to their usefulness. And so you have some value or some theories of psychology which are completely ridiculous. You have Alfred Kinsey, this complete lunatic psychologist from the mid previous century, who basically created this very self-serving ideology, this theory that all people are ultimately homosexual. And he did this by doing surveys of death row inmates. And so you go, this is useless stuff. This is meaningless psychology. Then you have other people like Abraham Maslow, who have what they call the hierarchy of needs, that turn out to be incredibly useful in predicting behavior, in helping us understand what it's like to live in a world where people don't have security, and why our kind of first world problems we talk about here, where the world is ending if Twitter cancels my username for 30 minutes, is somehow a big deal, while there are people around the world who don't have water to drink. And so psychology kind of ultimately becomes something we understand as a function of the value that it really has for us. And that has its own ups and downs. So that's psychology. What then is psychiatry? Psychiatry is the medical science of the brain, the mind, and the related chemicals associated with them. It's as essential as any other medical science. It has some interplay with psychology, of course, because there are behavioral conditions that may have a physical component, something like bipolar disorder that we used to call manic depression. Bipolar has a physical component, but it also has a behavioral component. And so treating that disease involves both drugs and medications as well as behavioral modifications. And so there is some interplay between psychology and psychiatry. Then that raises the question, what is therapy? What is psychoanalysis? How does that stuff work? And ultimately that becomes a broad spectrum of treatment protocols. So we've had our vocabulary lesson, treatment protocols that we would use to kind of tie those two fields together. How do I fix something? Whereas psychology, generally speaking, is how do I understand it? Psychology as a field of medical practice is generally more how do I fix it? Whereas psychiatry usually is more of the physical side, psychology is more of the emotional behavioral side. And so one of the questions a lot of folks turn to me with and say, well, can't I just turn to prayer? Can't God just fix whatever's there? If I have an emotional problem, if I'm struggling with the loss of a loved one, if I've got some great question in life, can't God just fix what's wrong with me? And of course the answer is, well, of course. Of course, God can heal. God can do anything God wants to do because God created us. At the same time, if my foot hurts, we say, can God heal that? Absolutely. But I still go to the doctor and I still say, hey, what can we do with this? There's a certain kind of reality that we have to face. And you say, well, Father, I'm not talking about just the psychiatric stuff, not the stuff that needs drugs. I'm talking about, if I've got some kind of emotional problem, can't God just fix that? Can't I just pray more or do some more novenas or read about the lives of the saints more? And ultimately, the answer to that comes down to, if you have a problem that is fundamentally psychological, you have a behavioral issue, you have a very mild addiction, can God fix it? Yes. Can prayer fix it? Yes. Will prayer help? Yes. Will the other spiritual exercises of the church help? Yes. If it's a psychiatric problem, if there's a chemical imbalance, if there's a gland that's shooting too much of something or not enough of something else, you're probably going to do better to have a medication, because while the spiritual path is going to help, you would just as soon go to the doctor for a foot problem or an ear, nose, and throat problem as you would go for a mental problem. If that problem, though, is really acute, if you have bipolar disorder, if you have OCD, if you have conditions that really are making it difficult to live an ordinary life, then I'd say, yes, you should pray, but you should definitely go see a doctor. And so there is a certain amount of give and take. If your problem is physical, you should go see a doctor. If your problem is entirely behavioral or emotional, prayer is going to make a big difference, but it might be helpful to see someone. If you've got an acute problem, and for whatever reason, you can't live life right now, you need to go see someone. I mean, the most common way that this happens is clinical depression. Clinical depression has a very strong, very clear series of things that happen, and it seems to people who have never had it that all you got to do is get out of bed and just go do something. Stop just laying around. But if you've ever known someone who actually has the condition, if you've ever been around someone who's bipolar, who's OCD, who's having panic attacks, who's having agoraphobia, it's not just a function of, hey, snap out of it. If you've ever met someone who has shell shock or PTSD, you know that it's not just a function of moral strength and fortitude. There are other things going on. So this leads me to start wanting to think about the role that therapy and counseling can and maybe should play in our own spiritual lives. Because there are sometimes, people go to therapy because they want to make a decision in life, or they go to therapy to assist in grieving, or they go to therapy to diagnose a psychiatric condition, or they go to therapy because the world seems like it's moving so fast and so chaotic that I've just got to do something to get a grip on something. it's worth stopping to note that priests are not trained in this. We're not. I had 2 psychology classes, 2, personality and psychology 101, and that's it. I had a vague counseling class, but most priests, unless they have a natural gift for listening or a natural gift for counseling, there's no meaningful training program. I mean, counseling, just to get a license in our country, in the United States, you're talking about 1,000 hours of practicum on top of tons of study and learning. And there's no way that the priestly formation program could step back and say, you need to take 3 years off to become an expert counselor before you can go forward to become a priest. And so while I don't want to denigrate priests, and I don't want to say anything negative about our brother priests, we priests cannot be the main source of counseling. We can provide something. We can provide some assistance, and hopefully your local pastor is willing to sit with you and talk and discuss and listen. Hopefully there is someone in your area, maybe your local pastor, who can be a spiritual director. A spiritual director is a kind of priest counselor who is meant to help you make a decision. And so you say to yourself, I want to be a nun. We got people who can talk about that. You say to yourself, I'm thinking about moving to Canada. You could do that too. A priest can talk to you about these sorts of things. Don't move to Canada. There's other things we can talk about you with and we can be helpful with. But at the end of the day, the priest is not a trained counselor. And so what if I find myself in a situation where I'm really having emotional problems? I'm addicted to something. I find myself unable to get out of bed 2 days a week. I go into panic attacks where my heart begins to palpitate and I begin to sweat vigorously and I start to feel slightly dizzy and I feel like I'm going to die. That's not the moment that's not the moment where you knock on the priest's door and say, hi, I was wondering if we could have a little talk. These are moments where you probably want to say to yourself, I need to invest in someone who is an expert in these things, either to help diagnose something or just to help me in a way that is very focused and directed. Now, again, prayer is going to be a very helpful thing. The spiritual life is going to be a helpful thing. And you know what? If one of my parishioners is in therapy, I would love it if they also came by and sat with me, once every 2 or 3 sessions. And let's talk about how it's going. Let's pray about it. Let's build into my spiritual life some ways to do that. What I don't want to give the impression of is that everybody has a psychological problem and that everybody is a lunatic and that everybody needs to go and find their salvation in Sigmund Freud. That's not remotely what I'm thinking. Most people are healthy enough to make it through the day. But when we find ourselves unable to, what I don't want to do is have someone say, I should be stronger. I should be holier. Psychologists have a phrase, don't should all over yourself. There's a danger in saying that I should, because I'm a Christian or because I'm a serious Catholic, I should have everything together. If you've ever met someone with PTSD, you know that strong, together people can be wounded and damaged and need assistance. And so it's one of these things I want us to think about and not lose touch with, because can't the Lord heal me no matter what I have? He can. But none of us is an island, as John Donne said. We pray and we go to the doctor when we have a physical ailment. Sometimes our prayer is impeded by chaos or grieving or illness or whatever. And sometimes we just need some help that's more directed and more focused. And sometimes, hey, our emotional issues are such that we need someone who knows about that aspect of humanity more. Now, I want to say something vaguely controversial, not too much. Most of the people watching this are rich. I mean, wildly rich by the world standards. Even if you're poor by U.S. standards, you're insanely rich by global standards. And the thing that's fascinating is that people who are poor, and I mean poor, living on less than $2 a day poor, like about 60% of the world population, those folks who are living in shacks made out of planks and of pallets in the barrios of Mexico, shockingly, don't have the same kind of psychological problems that the rich do, that we do. And it's one of these jokes that we put on Twitter of first world problems, but there is a profound correlation with wealth and safety and the idea that that I am as a human being am generally safe. I'm going to have enough food to eat tonight. I'm not generally going to face mortality today. And because of that, Americans, first worlders, Europeans tend to have more psychological problems. Now, it could just be that we're paying more attention to them. Don't know. But I do want to say, and the unpopular opinion is simply, if you've got an issue, it's worth looking at. It's worth thinking your way through. If you find yourself having some struggle, I don't want us to be like some of the millennial generation that are having a complete nervous breakdown because my Twitter handle got hacked. But I do want us to kind of look inside and be aware, because self-awareness is a part of the Christian life. The spiritual masters use different language for it. They talked about mastering the passions. But being self-aware, knowing myself, is essential. And in fact, if we look at the fruit of the Holy Spirit that St. Paul lays out in the book of the Ephesians, or the letter to the Ephesians, chapter 6, we see that kind of self-awareness is something that's built in to all of those fruits of the Spirit. So we should absolutely go to prayer with every anxiety, concern, cross, frustration, whatever that we have. We should develop a rich, strong spiritual life now, before we have any major issues to work on. That includes prayer and fasting and works of mercy and journaling and studying and all sorts of the things that we need to do to have a rich spiritual life. We should now go and develop a spiritual friendship with our priest, our deacon, nuns who are in the parish. Now is the time to do that, before you need to call at 4 a.m. because you're having a panic attack. There's a whole day set aside to buying your priest a beer. You just missed it, but hey, there's a good opportunity to invite the deacon over, invite the nuns over. Go bring a bottle of wine. The nuns will drink a bottle of wine. I guarantee the nuns will drink a bottle of wine with you. It's a good opportunity to build those friendships now, rather than waiting until you call and you say, hi, you don't know me. I shook your hand at the end of Mass for the last 4 years, but I need your help and I need you to invest a lot of energy in me right now. That's a very challenging thing to do in times of chaos, but boy, is it an easy thing to do now when you have the free time. And so if something begins to weigh you down, we should reach out to religious resources. Give the Lord, an opportunity to bring that healing. But if we suspect that the Lord is not going to do that for us in a timely manner, which is one of the crosses the Lord might give us, don't be a martyr to some kind of should, ought to, or whatever. Take advantage of the resources we have. We have enormous amounts of gifts in this nation. Amidst all of our complexes and anxieties and whatevers and our hang-ups, we have an enormous number of resources and gifts. And so if you have an issue, if you have an anxiety, if you have a concern, if you have something weighing you down, there's no contradiction between being a person of faith and looking to the Lord to bring healing and reaching out to someone who might be able to provide professional services for us, either in the psychiatric world, which is a medical condition, or in the psychological world, which deals with our behavioral concerns. I mean, I know me personally, all priests generally have to go through some counseling just as part of the program. I had to go through, I think it was like an hour a week for maybe 6 months or 8 months or something like that. It was just something that was part of the program. You go to counseling. And I remember it being absolutely wonderful. I remember there being some goofy things. One of the things that was silly, I looked at my counselor and he's like, so tell me about your aphasia, kind of the classic Freudian thing. And so we talked, and one of the things that I had not really been aware of is I had a fear of ghosts. Can there be anything goofier? No, but I mean, this wasn't a mild fear. This was a serious, debilitating fear of ghosts that I had never been super aware of. And I mean, and so I talked about it with my shrink, and it was wonderful to get that stuff off my chest. And it turned out to be having some vague effects in different parts of my life. And so, hey, is that a first world problem? You bet it is. But it's the kind of thing where now I have this experience where I know that if I've got something that suddenly or unexpectedly is weighing me down, I know how that works. I know someone I can call. I have a sense of a relationship with someone I can reach out to. And do I, from time to time, ask the Lord to help me deal with this anxiety, this fear, this concern? You bet. The world's a hot, steaming mess. It's 2020. But at the same time, I know that if things get too bad, that there's people I can reach out to, that there are people I can call upon to help me. And we all, I think, have to keep that in the back of our minds, that while we want to be strong and independent Americans, we also need to be humble enough to realize when we need help. You know, if I've got a problem with my foot, or I've got a problem with my back, or I've got a problem with my chemicals and myself, I need to reach out to people who specialize in that. There is nothing opposed to faith and science in principle. There can be that some of the psychology, the philosophical aspects of the psychology are opposed. Like I said, some of them, you know, say God doesn't exist from the beginning. A lot of kind of Freudian, Jungian stuff, that's a problem, and there's going to be conflict there. But being a person of faith and being a person who reaches out to a therapist or reaches out to a psychiatrist, there's nothing wrong with that. They really are two parts, what John Paul II would call two lungs, and we need to breathe with both of those lungs. So if you find yourself having some struggles, whether it's on this feast, or not this feast, whether it's on the anniversary of the death of Sigmund Freud or not, whether you kind of lean more the Freud direction or you lean more the Padre Pio direction, you know, there's an incredible, wonderful coincidence in these two starkly opposed people, each representing a good, each representing a benefit, and each representing a kind of benefit that works in conjunction with one another. And so I hope this is in some way helpful for you. If you are someone who's struggling with a mental issue, with a mental health issue, with a psychiatric issue, I do wish you the very best. And please know I'm praying for folks who have those kinds of issues a lot. For people in my family are in that boat. But if you have issues, please don't let our faith turn us away from seeking the help that we might need. So again, I hope this is helpful for you. It's just a simple little touch base. If you do have any questions, you can leave them in the comments. You can contact me directly in all the appropriate social media ways. I have been Father Ryan Humphreys. This has been the CU Catecast. I hope you have a wonderful day. Stupid thing.